honor for me and a great opportunity, because this is, I'm ashamed to admit, the first time in your country. I only know about Hungary from reading over the years, European history, and not much. And I knew about the pushta, because we learned about the pushta in primary school. And I'm so delighted now to have a friend and colleague here whose very name indicates that she is from the pushta. So this is a great opportunity for me. I don't pretend to say much which you will be able to instantly, in a sense, relate to the Hungarian context, because the topic that I have is really framed with at least intended strong awareness about the importance of the context. Whatever I show to be true in the city of Oslo need not at all be true in the city of Budapest. I don't know, but the context matters very much for how easily minorities become part of the larger community in which they are found, and their relations with other groups. And I know studies from other countries which don't show what I will show to be probably the case in Oslo. The other point I also should make, I know I have very little time, and I hope that you will wave a hand when I have only 5 minutes left, I can wrap it. But the other point is I became interested in this because I have been myself a bit of a migrant. As a student, I had a chance to spend time in the United States as a sort of academic. I worked for many years in Britain, and I also worked in the United States against in an international agency, so I moved between countries. And one of the things that happened to me is that I found a wife from another country. So whenever we are either in Norway or in the United States, one of us is an immigrant, if you wish. And we have children who are not only children of at least one immigrant wherever they are, but who also are likely to be perceived as a visible minority because they look as if they might be Japanese. Because my wife is third generation, admittedly, Japanese American. And that means that they would experience in my native Norway, for example, people wondering what they were really from. What are you really from? Being perceived as different and having to cope with that, even if they spoke Norwegian fluently after a while, and so on and so on. So this is a personal topic. I started by doing opportunistic research on large-scale survey data in Norway in the early 90s, and I've followed it up, and this is simply the last round of something to which I have returned, but it's not what I have mainly been doing all these years. So that's just a small point. About the topic itself, I'm centrally concerned with identification with own ethnicity. And in the context of the study, this simply means the group that young people themselves say they consider to be their people, in a sort of German folk sense. For those of you who are familiar with German, probably more than I am, that means basically an ethnic group, people in the sense of an ethnic group. So they were asked questions in a large-scale survey about their ethnic group and how they related to that group. And the other key term here is integration, which I simply mean something that becomes part of a larger whole. And there is much written about ethnic integration, integration of immigrants and so on. For those of you who want to that, and one of the key contributions is work in Britain by Auger and Strang, I think they might be pronounced as, who point to various indicators of integration for specifically immigrant minorities. And the most tangible, publicly visible ones have to do with education for themselves, but especially for the next generation of their children. And it has to do with the health conditions, because health is a condition, not least mental health, for being able to cope with the society in which you find yourself. And then there is, of course, occupation, source of income, and there is housing. Now, I only touch among these to some extent on health, because I'm concerned with the science of good, very good mental health. But I also touch on education, which is our joint concern here. How do they do with the education system? I'm not addressing the question of occupation or housing, because that is really not so obviously relevant for adolescents who are still students in school, although they, of course, they need a family income for themselves and they need housing, but that's more in the realm of their parents. And then I'm concerned about integration in the social sense. One thing is the strength of identification you have with your own group, which may or may not be helpful in a given context for furthering that integration in the larger community. But the social side is openness to other groups than your own. Are the two contradictory, so that the more you identify as a minority person in another country, the less well you are likely to associate and be open to other groups around you? Or are they not related, or are they even positively related? That's sort of one of the questions, one of the very first ones. And then, I think that's enough for the very early comments here, and I will probably need more time than I have, but I know you're already behind schedule a little bit, so I can also spend 20 minutes and round it up if you have to. Okay, now let's see, I hope this works. Just in case we don't have time to go through everything here, I can summarize my conclusions already in the context of Oslo, which need not apply to other, even urban contexts. Children of immigrants worked harder than the majority to put more time into homework, either because they are strongly motivated or just because they have to in order to keep up. But they don't achieve quite as well in terms of average grades or marks. But this, in the case of Oslo, seems to be entirely due to such characteristics of their family as parental level of schooling, father's occupation, or how many books there are in the home, indicators of social status or cultural capital, and so on. So it's not as if they achieve less well due to other circumstances, which one might well expect. The language gap, for example, between the family language and the language used in the school. It doesn't seem to be so important. It seems to be something that children who grow up in a country with one language in their family, with another language in society around them, cope with. And they have generally high educational admission. These are not particularly unique findings. Other research point towards similar conclusions in Norway, but also in a number of other countries. But the second point is that is quite common for youth to identify strongly with their own ethnic group. It's also common for them at the same time to have a strong openness to other groups. And indeed, these traits seem to be positively correlated, not negatively correlated, as you might expect if you were as an immigrant skeptic. Tend to be positively correlated. And then also, if you look at such measures for the majority group, those who are not immigrants or children of immigrants, you could say at least they're not negatively correlated. So it's not as if a strong ethnic identity tends to be at the expense of social blockage for interaction and identification with those that you see as ethnic others. Tends to be the other way around. I'm not going to offer an obvious explanation because there could be more than one. We can get to it if I have time. And then other details. Among the largest immigrant group in the city of Oslo, those from families who came from Pakistan, there's some support for what some of you may recognize as sort of the multicultural education or acculturation view, in the sense that educational achievement is highest among those who have a combined orientation of strong ethnic identification as people from not necessarily Pakistan, even Punjab in Pakistan, on one hand, and at the same time, high openness to other groups. In keeping with the multicultural pedagogic arguments about the importance of doing both, recognizing the importance of identity and separateness, showing respect for the children's culture, but at the same time also introducing them into the larger society and culture in which they live. But among the other groups, who I call visible minorities in the sense that they, like my children, look different, other groups that are from Asian countries or African countries, the educational achievement is highest among those who have a weak ethnic identification, but strong openness, a kind of an assimilationist orientation, where you put your own background behind you, which may be at some considerable social cost, and you want to be part of the larger whole, and you are motivated to interact with and appreciate and so on the larger society around you, whether that is the majority group or just another urban ethnic mix. But among other groups who are what I would call invisible minority, like Hungarians in Norway would be an invisible minority. We had a number of Hungarians after 1956 who became an invisible minority. Not much was done to help them except get them settled and so on, and they're not perceived as different, I think, by the rest, and probably not so much by themselves either by now. For such groups, Swedes in Norway, for example, Germans in Norway, or Poles in Norway, weak ethnic identification combined with strong openness is equally conducive, if you can put that, because it's not so clear what is cause and effect here, to such higher educational achievement in school among adolescents. And finally, that orientations which include strong ethnic identification, whether they are combined with openness to others or not combined with such openness, are conducive to having a positive self-concept. Now, I am not a psychologist. I even believe that people can have too much faith in themselves. But generally speaking, in social psychology, it is thought to be a good thing to have a strong self-concept. Like the person you are, rather than be torn by doubts and depressions about the way you are or look and so on. And in orientations, combinations that include strong ethnic identification are associated with having a strongly positive self-concept. That's the gist, and if this were a conference where I was given 15 minutes, I could round it up here. But and you must stop me when you, for the sake of the further progress of the conference, need to, have a break and so on. But I will go further with your permission until I'm stopped. And I should say that one of the reasons why I became interested in this to begin with, in a sort of academic language, call it my theoretical starting point. One of them was social capital theory, in which there is such a thing as people arguing that ethnic communities, for immigrants especially, but also for others, are a social resource for education specifically, by helping to keep young people from being tempted into activities which are risky or even lead to crime, and sort of say it's like an adult world that encloses people in a social space that keeps them on a kind of track which points towards education, because minorities value education. It's just a question of whether they are able to achieve it for their children. Ethnic communities are seen as a resource beyond the family, according to a number of qualitative studies in a number of countries, including such work in Norway. So ethnic social capital for education and arguments from that is one of the starting points, which leads one to be optimistic about the consequences of strong ethnic identification. And the other starting point is typologies developed by a Canadian called Jon Lauglo, some of you may have come across. Typologies of acculturation which refer precisely to combinations of self-group regard, ethnic identification on the one hand, and on the other hand, openness to the larger world around, where so-called multicultural integration means trying to do both, being open to others, and schools should promote this, of course, but also hold on to yourself, hold on to where you come from, don't forget about your roots. The last idea, of course, is one of the main legacies of the Romantic movement in Europe and profoundly influences the way people think about minorities still. And another type is separation, where you reject the world around and you put yourself into your own enclave and identify strongly with that. And another type is assimilation, where you put your own world behind, but identify strongly with surrounding society. And then there are those who are neither identifying with their society in a particularly strong way, other groups, but they don't identify with their own group either, with distinctly weak group bonds. And in their scheme, those are called the marginalized ones, ethnically marginalized ones. And that sounds like a terrible predicament. But there are also social theories that say that there are advantages of not having very strong ties to other groups. A marginal man theorizing, for example, from the 1920s, based on observation of immigrant groups in Chicago, or places, are those that are free from tight group bonds. So there's a positive argument for what otherwise is known as marginalization in a negative sense, and so on. So that's a starting point. Okay. The data that I have been working on are survey data. In Norway, there's an organization called NOVA, which is kind of a quasi-official but independent foundation that conducts youth surveys, and one of them was young people in Oslo in 2006. It's a large survey in that one tried to reach more than 11,000 students in the two top forms in lower secondary school. That's the top 2 years of basic education in Norway. So school leaving cannot occur before you are 16, and then very few leave. And then from the first year in upper secondary school, which nearly everyone enters in Norway, although many, unfortunately, drop out without any credentials from upper secondary education, something which is a pervasive problem in many European countries, probably in Hungary too, I don't know. In any case, those are the students that were sampled from 75 schools, high response rate, and 25% are from families where both parents immigrated to Norway. So that's the material I used to compare with the majority group in that particular setting. And there are also some limitations. For example, you never get answers to all questions, even if you have a questionnaire you can use. And that is especially the problem if you need many, many items in order to construct an index and so on, technical things. Now, I'm not going to go into details, and it's hard to see and too many figures, but this is the kind of analysis which I did to begin with on educational effort, performance, and ambition. And the groups you see to the left, where you have the majority population, and way to the right, you see the number of observations in the sample. So you see there are more than 5,000 in the majority population, and then I include with country specification groups that were originally, they were about at least 90 cases. Here they are a little bit reduced because not all have relevant information that I can use. And then I group the others into other visible minorities. Simply minorities that are physically identifiable as probably not being of the majority. And then there are those who are from Europe or OECD, who I call invisible minorities, or sort of fairly large, very mixed groups. I'm not primarily interested here in comparing the Somalis and the Vietnamese and the Iranians. Samples are a bit small for that purpose, but I'm interested in seeing if there's a consistent pattern across, on one hand, like these visible minorities, and also for the invisible minorities, that sets them apart from the majority. And in the column to the left under effort, you see, if you have good eyes, figures on estimated homework per day in response to a question about how many hours a day do you normally work on your homework, and with 5, 6 response options from which you can compute hours expressed here in a decimal fashion. And the striking thing, as shown by all these numbers that are green, the green is to show that they are higher than the majority figure on the very top of the column. That every single minority group has a higher number of hours on the average per day on homework, roughly estimated, than the majority does. They work harder. And they maybe work harder because they have to, but they work harder. show that separately, but in general there is a tendency for that, but there are also some groups where that is not apparent, but in no case do the girls work less hard than the boys. Probably not revolutionizing, probably a finding you have come across before. The success stories of the education system are increasingly female. Then comes the question of performance, which is only roughly indicated by grade point average on a scale from 1 to 6 in mathematics, Norwegian language, and English, core academic subjects as in most countries. And there the numbers are red in most cases, showing that the figures are lower than for the majority. So they perform a little bit less. But that lower performance is generally entirely due, as I've already told you about conclusion, to the socio-economic characteristics of the family. Parents' level of schooling in particular, how many books there are in the home, and the connection the family has with the occupational structure. And if you adjust for those differences and also adjust for the fact that a minority of the adolescents are not Norwegians in the sense of being born in Norway, but they are themselves immigrants. They are all children of immigrants. If you adjust for that, you can estimate hypothetical grade point averages, as I do in the third column here. I'm not sure where the arrow is. You see it? No, you can't. Okay, whereas that's a hypothetical GPA. And then the differences from the majority, in most cases, if there is a difference, becomes a positive one. Considering the parental level of education, they do in a number of cases, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, Iraq, India, and those from places like Hungary, they do better than the locals. Possibly because they work harder. And in only one case, and I cannot explain why, those with a Turkish background, is there's still a sort of lower performance. It may be that it has to do with the prevalence of small-scale shops and so on that pull young people into productive work at an earlier age. I don't know. Finally, here in this figure, as shown in the fourth column, the second one from the right, the percentage who say they expect higher education. Again, there are stars showing there are some gender differences here, and then in those cases it's always the girls who more often than boys expect higher education. And these are figures which you would expect to be different because of the influence of grades, and the average grades are lower in the case of all these specified minority groups, except with those with a background from India. But without any taking account of that, the percentage expecting higher education is either as high as the majority, the black figures, or it is higher than the majority, the green figures, where it's a little bit lower. So on the whole, the education findings are mixed, but the consistent positive finding is that there is greater effort, which is in keeping with much writing about immigrants, the reasons why people immigrate, the sense that in a new place one starts with a clean slate and needs to make more effort in order to survive, in order to manage, in order for the children to have a future. So this is the first thing. Then, how are we doing in terms of time? 10 minutes, okay. The two scales I developed are not developed by myself. They are copied from earlier work, scales that are widely used internationally, originally developed in the States by Finney, who is a psychologist in California, I think. And ethnic identification is an adaptation of her items, not identical with them, but an adaptation. And here I'm translating back to English, but they were of course phrased in Norwegian. Questions like the following: I have tried to find out more about my ethnic group, or I participate actively in organizations whose members are mainly from my own ethnic groups, or at the attitude level, I have a clear sense of my background, I feel strongly I belong, I'm proud of my ethnic group, I take part in my ethnic group's traditions, and so on. And it forms an attitude or identification dimension with the, high indications of internal consistency for those of you who are statistician, alpha coefficients, that kind of thing. It's an established scale, adapted event. So the interesting thing is then how one scores on that scale which one can produce, which has an average, which could range from score 1, there's one score 4, and I will turn to that. And there is a simple scale of openness to other ethnic groups. I like meeting and getting to know people from other ethnic groups. I spend time with them. I participate in activities. I like being with people from, and then I negatively formulated items. I don't want to be friends with people from other ethnic groups. Other ethnic groups needs, of course, much to be specified. Which group? What kind of group? It can vary, it can depend. But nonetheless, there's also picks up a dimension which seems to be reasonably internally consistent, and with answers ranging from fully agree, mostly disagree, or entirely disagree, on scoring that on a 1 to 4 scale, and computing an average score for the whole scale. One gets measures like this. Here, the blue columns are average scores on the ethnic identification measure, and the red column is average score on the openness for other groups measure. And the possible range is from 1 to 4. And anything that is higher than 2.5 is a prevalently sort of strong or positive, respectively, ethnic identification or openness to other groups. The simple finding is that the overall scale scores are quite high, showing that even in the group where ethnic identification is not so strong, and that is particularly the Norwegian ethnic majority, it is still 2.8. It's higher than 2.5, which would be the cutting point between mostly agree and mostly disagree. So that the Norwegians feel mostly identify with their own ethnic group, as measured here. And that is consistently higher for all the minorities. Perhaps not surprising, being a minority reminds you that you are one. And growing up with parents who speak another language at home and have other customs than the neighbors or people around reminds you that you are one. And this reflects a prevalently positive orientation that is stronger among the minorities than among the majority to one's ethnic group. One simply has a stronger sense of ethnicity, separateness. It is not something you can just take for granted in the same way. And then the same is interesting with regard to openness to others. Maybe a minority cannot escape a certain amount of openness because you cannot function in the larger world around you unless you develop links and connections. That may be. But the fact is that they are more open to other groups than Yeah, I know I can do that, but I want to point to the little arrow on the screen. Never mind. In any case, all the columns to the right are groupings either by country or aggregates or minority groups. And then you have one column to the left, which is the majority group. And the consistent pattern is that both ethnic identification and openness to other groups will be higher if you are a minority than if you are in the majority. Perhaps not earth-shaking, but it does say something about how people perceive themselves and others. So far, nothing that is earth-shaking. This is a finding that I like because I don't think it has been shown much before. And it basically shows that both of these traits are positively correlated. For all minority groups, although they are varying sample size here, and some of the smaller cases to the right, India, Iran, are based on very small samples, but are all significantly positive, different from zero by normal statistical testing. Also for the majority to the left, where it is a correlation of 0.04. It is not negative. Now, that is a totally negligible positive relationship, of course. In any event, I would say that you need a correlation at least about 0.15, 0.2 or 0.25 in order to attach any kind of substantive value to it. And most of these are not much higher than that. But they are all positive, in a positive direction. So the two traits do not behave statistically as if one occurred at the expense of the other. They occur either as if one possibly could influence the other, which optimists might think ethnic identification does, or as if they have some shared underlying cause, which I think is more likely. It could be that both ethnic identification, openness to others, some of you will be psychologists, know this literature more than I do, are rooted in a person's greater cognitive capacity, or some kind of capacity to look beyond the immediate world around you, your family, yourself, and care about others, identify with others that are larger than your very private space. And ethnic group is one such, and beyond that there are all the others. I mean, that may be something to pursue further, but the point is they are positively correlated. Then in the paper that is being revised, in which these kinds of associations are examined, I construct different acculturation orientations. That is, different combinations of ethnic identification and openness to others. I've alluded to them already. And then I compare, but I have to combine the various minority groups in order to have large enough numbers to do meaningful comparisons later. I compare the majority to the left with what I call invisible minority, Hungarians, Poles, Swedes, and so on, with families in Norway. 5 minutes, I will stick to it. And then I take out the Pakistani because there are enough of them to keep a separate analysis for them, and then the other visible minorities. And what it shows is that for all immigrant groups, or immigrant family groups, whether they are invisible minorities or visible minorities, the largest type of orientation, if you take those with very high scores on both scales, at least a score of 3. The very most prevalent orientation is so-called multicultural integration. And then if you look at the red area, you have those who are, could be described, if you are looking at minorities, as assimilation-minded. You have those who are high only on openness to others, but have weak attachment to their own group, but they are high on their openness to others. So you can conclude that something like 80% of the minorities have an acculturation orientation, which includes distinctly high openness to other groups. There are very few of the minorities who display what is here in green color, high only on ethnic identification. That's, in fact, higher among the majority. But there too, it's a minority of the majority of 16.5%, shown to the left here. Now, then I use these orientations, these types, if you wish, to look at academic performance within each group. The groups will be of highly different size, because it's not very common to be, for example, having weak ethnic identification and weak openness to others. And this basically shows that combinations which either include both strong openness and strong ethnic identification in the case of those with a Pakistani background, or also those who are simply stressing openness to others in the case of other visible minorities, and even more strongly so in the case of invisible minorities, are the ones who do a little bit better in school. In other words, it's not an entirely clear-cut pattern. It depends on the background, whether a given acculturation orientation seems to facilitate, or at least is positively associated with, better school performance. Finally, I look at self-concept, and there the conclusion is that any acculturation orientation which includes strong ethnic identification, whether, as in the case of the blue areas, it also includes strong openness to others, or in the case of the green areas, it does not. Those orientations are associated with the highest scores on the self-concept measure, which I don't really have the time to go into detail about. But those are the findings, and here's the summary which I've already given you. So thank you very much, and I can say for me it was an interesting journey to do this work, and it basically probably ends with the conclusion that strong ethnic identification is not really a problem. It is usually combined with strong openness to others, stronger than for those who don't have a strong ethnic identification. It is something that goes clearly with a positive self-concept, and it is, if combined with openness to others, something which usually goes with doing a little bit better in school, regardless of what you may argue are the causal complexities behind it. Thank you.
So let me take the opportunity of thanking your contribution, Erich, our digital researcher, and let me hope that in the next time you might also contribute, probably with this lecture with others. A remarkable question to remark is that probably I can answer for it in the form of a question. Do you think that this your findings depend on the type of culture the ethnic group is holding or has been associated as a cultural phenomenon? What I remind is that different ethnic groups have, of course, different cultures. And probably there are cultures where the openness is embedded, while in other culture it is not. And if you come across with, if you compare these cultures, you can easily feel that, well, ethnic identification is going together with openness, or is not going. For instance, take a fundamentalist group, which identify itself with fundamentalist values, where the key value is not to be open. So probably you answer, you understand. But my question is more theoretical than this. You regularly use the word integrated. My hunch is probably it's a different literature. Probably in the last, let's say, 10 years, instead of integration, a new concept took place, which was inclusion. Now, does it make a difference, or you may use these words as so
thank you.
Professor Kosma, I have also admired your work, and we had the pleasure of taking an airplane trip once. You may not remember, but I do. You asked, of course, difficult questions, but I can say that in my data, I don't find traces of one thing occurring at the expense of the other as a main trend. But of course, there will be individual exceptions. There will be individual exceptions who become what others perceive to be fundamentalists in a defensive way. It could be that one of the phenomena associated with migration is a tendency to have greater spread in outcomes than if one compares it with groups that are stably located in a place. It's like a cross-country skiing. If you go uphill and you are in a competition, some people manage and they proceed and they do very well, but others collapse. It could be that the adversity of having to handle a more demanding social set of complexity makes for a greater spread in outcomes. And I think research on migration and adaptation outcomes of migration could be usefully informed by looking at novels about migration to the United States, for example, historically from Norway. And in many of these novels that I have read, the author always includes those who succeed with lots of hard work, and they prevail, and they have enormous energy, and they cope, and yes, it was worth it in a sense, but also those who collapse mentally, you can't cope with it, who end up being shifted away to some insane asylum on the prairie, and those who perish in the big cities. So authors have long thought of this, I think, novelists, as a strainful experience, and there are many different outcomes can be alienation, marginalization, but it can also be prevailing and doing it in spite of. I think novels and stories of the qualitative kind about immigrants and immigrant families have all these things. So yes, it is possible with some cultures, so to say, breed more of this than others. I think it's an empirical question. I don't find any trace of it in this material. It's possible. Inclusion and integration. Integration is certainly a contested term, possibly because it has an undertone of it's the group that should adapt to the majority. They should be integrated. It has a strong normative tone from the perspective, if you wish, of the majority, that takes the larger context as granted. But inclusion tries to do the other thing. Tries to also, sort of looking at it from the majority's point of view, but it has a normative connotation of the majority of the larger society allowing inclusion to occur, puts the onus more clearly on their shoulders, so it's a politically more correct term to use. But it is a form of integration in the sense of something becoming a more integral part of a larger